When Iraq pushed into its neighbor, people expected a political showdown. But nobody expected ordinary British families to get caught in the chaos. Soon, the world was seeing disturbing scenes that hinted that something was very wrong. It became one of the darkest moments of the entire crisis, and no one knew how far it would go. It began quietly, in the years right after Iraq's long fight with Iran finally stopped in 1988. That war had dragged on for 8 exhausting years. The country had poured almost everything it had into the conflict. When the guns went silent, Iraq was stepping out of a graveyard. Nearly 200,000 Iraqi soldiers had died. Many more came home injured or missing limbs. Families were broken, hospitals struggled with the wounded. And while people tried to rebuild their lives, the government faced a financial disaster. Iraq had spent billions on weapons, supplies, and military operations. The treasury was almost dry. Major parts of Iraq needed fixing. Roads were cracked from heavy military transport. Factories had outdated machines that barely worked. Oil refineries needed new parts and repairs. These places were important because Iraq depended on oil money to survive. But repairing them required cash the governments simply didn't have. Despite all this, Saddam Hussein stood in front of the country as if everything was fine. He called the war a victory and blamed others for Iraq's problems. On the inside, Iraq was sinking, and the biggest weight dragging it down was debt. Several Arab countries had supported Iraq financially, which didn't want Iran to win. By 1988, these debts added up to more than $40 billion. Kuwait alone had given about $14 billion. Saddam did not want to pay any of it back. He expected these countries to treat the money like a gift, not a loan, but Kuwait insisted it wanted repayment, which made Saddam feel cornered and angry. At the time, oil prices around the world were falling. Iraq needed high prices to recover, but Kuwait increased its oil production, which pushed prices down even more. Kuwait said it was simply following market rules. Saddam believed they were doing it on purpose, as if they wanted Iraq to stay weak. Each time the price dropped, Iraq lost millions it desperately needed. Saddam saw Kuwait's actions as disrespect, even hostility. This slow buildup of anger kept growing across 1989. Saddam believed Kuwait was taking advantage of Iraq's weakness after the war. By early 1990, talks between the two countries were barely working, and by the middle of the year, Saddam made a choice that changed the entire region. He stopped arguing and started moving troops toward Kuwait's border. Everything changed before most people opened their eyes that morning. Around 2 a.m. on the 2nd of August 1990, Iraqi tanks, armored vehicles, and infantry crossed the border in a massive wave. More than 100,000 Iraqi soldiers moved in at once, supported by helicopters and fighter jets. The attack was fast, organized, and designed to shock Kuwait into collapsing before it could react. Kuwait's own army was small, around 16,000 troops, and most of them were not positioned near the border. Many were still asleep in their bases. When Iraqi forces pushed toward Kuwait City, the local soldiers tried to resist in scattered pockets, but they were completely outnumbered and outgunned. In some areas, fighting lasted only minutes. By the evening of August 3rd, Iraq had full control over every government building, major highway, and both airports. Within 48 hours, Kuwait as an independent state was essentially gone. But the invasion didn't just hit the Kuwaiti government. It hit the people who lived normal lives, woke up early for work, and had nothing to do with politics. Kuwait was a busy place with a growing economy, so it relied heavily on foreign workers. There were people from Britain, the United States, India, the Philippines, Egypt, Pakistan, and many other countries. Because Kuwait was safe and stable before the invasion, many foreigners brought their families with them. Among all these groups, there were hundreds of British citizens, including oil engineers from companies like BP, technical experts stationed near the Burgan oil fields, teachers working in international schools, and medical staff in Kuwait City hospitals. Many of them lived in areas such as Salmiya, Fahil, Khawali, and Ahmadi, which were some of the first places Iraqi troops entered. Most British families woke up hearing gunfire, explosions, and the rumble of tanks on the roads outside their homes. Some tried calling the British embassy, but the lines were jammed or suddenly went dead. Others grabbed passports, cash, or baby supplies and rushed to their cars, hoping to reach the Saudi border. A few tried to get to Kuwait International Airport, desperately praying that flights were still leaving. But Iraq's plan had been extremely detailed. Within hours, Iraqi soldiers set up checkpoints at every major road. They blocked the highways leading south towards Saudi Arabia. They surrounded the airport and shut it down. Anyone who tried to leave was stopped, questioned, and usually sent back. Cars were searched, passports were taken. Many people were told that all movement was now under Iraqi control. Kuwait was sealed shut. Within days after that, almost every major country reacted. The United States held emergency meetings and passed resolutions demanding that Iraq leave Kuwait immediately. Then came the pressure that hit Iraq where it hurts: the economic sanctions. These sanctions froze Iraq's money overseas, blocked trade, and cut off supplies. For a country already struggling financially after the Iran-Iraq War, this was a heavy blow. Iraq needed imported equipment, medicine, and spare parts for its oil industry. Now, many of those supplies were stopped at the border or refused by foreign companies. Meanwhile, the United States made a major move. President George H.W. Bush ordered tens of thousands of American troops into Saudi Arabia to protect it from a possible Iraqi attack. The operation became known as Operation Desert Shield. British forces soon landed as well, followed by soldiers from France, Canada, Egypt, Syria, and many other countries. By the end of August 1990, more than 20 countries were preparing to stand against Iraq, and more were joining every week. From Saddam's point of view, this was a nightmare. He had assumed Kuwait would be a quick win, and that the world would eventually accept it, just like some past border changes in other regions. Instead, he watched a giant military force forming right next to him. Aircraft carriers arrived in the Gulf. Fighter jets were stationed across Saudi air bases. Supply lines stretched for miles. Saddam now faced a problem he had not planned for. Time was moving against him. Every day, the coalition grew stronger. And every day, Iraq's economy sank deeper because of the sanctions. He needed a way to slow the world down, something that would make foreign leaders hesitate before moving their armies toward Iraq. That's when his attention turned to the foreign civilians trapped inside Kuwait and Iraq. He realized these people could be useful to him. Soon, soldiers walked into hotels where many foreigners had been staying while waiting for a chance to leave. Guests eating breakfast were ordered to stand up and hand over their passports. Workers inside oil company offices were told to step away from their desks. Families relaxing in their apartments heard knocks on the door, followed by armed men telling them to come outside. Some people didn't even have time to gather personal items. They were simply taken. Every route out of Kuwait was blocked. Buses heading towards Saudi Arabia were stopped on the highway. The passengers were forced to get out while their bags were searched. The airport in Kuwait City had already been shut down, but now even airports inside Iraq were closing their doors. Some travelers sitting inside planes ready to take off were suddenly told to get out because flights were canceled. They had no choice but to return to terminals already filled with frightened families from around the world. Iraq tried to give the situation a harmless name. Saddam called these people his guests, as if they were being treated with kindness. But the truth was understood instantly by every person involved. A guest chooses to stay. These people had no choice. They were hostages, being held so the world would slow down its plans against Iraq. The number of Westerners taken kept rising. In total, more than 1,000 were detained. Out of them, around 400 were British citizens, including men, women, and children. They were trapped in a situation far outside anything they had ever imagined. They were told they could not leave their hotels or temporary shelters without permission. In some cases, soldiers escorted them everywhere. Once Saddam had control of these hostages, he made a decision that changed everything. He didn't gather them into a large camp or keep them near the capital. Instead, Iraqi officials broke them into small groups and sent them to different parts of the country. This was done carefully, not randomly. Each destination had a specific purpose. Some British men were taken south to Basra, a major industrial area. There they were kept inside oil refineries and nearby sites that handled fuel and chemicals. These places were important for Iraq's economy, and Saddam wanted them protected. Holding foreigners there forced the coalition to think twice before planning any airstrike. Others were taken far north to Mosul, where Iraq operated large power stations that supplied electricity to wide regions. Being placed so close to this equipment made the hostages feel constantly unsafe, especially since these stations were obvious military targets if war broke out. A number of hostages were brought to the outskirts of Baghdad, where Iraq produced military parts and equipment. These factories were heavily guarded, and the workers there could hear machines running day and night. Being surrounded by the sounds of a country preparing for war only made the fear worse. A smaller group of foreigners, including some British citizens, was placed near missile storage sites. These were some of the most dangerous locations because they were tied to Iraq's long-range weapons. The hostages did not know exactly where they were, but they understood enough to realize they were close to something the world considered threatening. The separation of families was one of Saddam's coldest tactics. Husbands and wives were put on different buses without warning. Children were taken to other sites, often with only a single parent, or sometimes none at all. People were left not knowing where their relatives were taken or if they were safe. Some tried to ask Iraqi guards for information, but the guards rarely answered. With every passing hour, the situation felt heavier. Then, in the last days of August 1990, Iraqi state television aired something no one expected. Viewers inside Iraq and around the world suddenly saw British families sitting in a room with Saddam Hussein. They were ordinary people who had been living peaceful lives just weeks earlier. The camera moved slowly across their faces. Mothers tried to hold their children close. Fathers sat stiffly, unsure of what would happen next. The children looked lost, unable to understand why they were being shown to millions of strangers. Saddam sat with them, acting relaxed, as if everything was normal. The footage spread quickly. It appeared on TV stations across the UK. Newspapers printed the faces of the hostages the next morning. Families back home recognized their relatives instantly. The shock hit the British public hard. Many people had believed the hostages were being kept quietly somewhere. Now they saw the truth in the cold glare of the camera. After the TV appearance, the experience of captivity became different for each group, depending on where they were held. Some were kept in hotels in Baghdad. They were stuck inside rooms that felt smaller each day. Others ended up in remote facilities. These places often had limited food and basic supplies. Water could run low. Electricity could cut out. Some rooms were overcrowded, leaving families with barely enough space to sleep. Many hostages didn't even have the chance to talk to other groups because they were kept separated. A few were placed in private Iraqi homes, but even this came with tight control. An Iraqi minder lived with them, watching every move, listening to every conversation, and reporting anything unusual. The hostages had no privacy. They didn't know who they could trust. Communication with the outside world was almost completely gone. Telephones were blocked, mail didn't move, radios were taken away. People had no way to hear news about their own countries. They didn't know if their governments were planning a rescue or preparing for war. As days passed, the uncertainty grew heavier. No one knew how long this would last. No one knew what Saddam would do next. Once the world realized Iraq was holding hundreds of Western civilians, governments everywhere scrambled to find a peaceful way out. Diplomats flew into Baghdad from different regions, some from Europe hoping to talk Saddam into softening his position, others from the Middle East trying to use regional ties. and a few from Asia attempting to act as neutral mediators. Alongside these officials, a number of religious leaders also traveled to Iraq. Some were Christian priests, some were Muslim scholars, and others came from interfaith groups. They believed that appealing to moral responsibility might convince Saddam to free at least the elderly, the sick, and the children. But Saddam knew exactly what he was doing. He stretched the crisis as far as he could because these hostages gave him power. Back in Britain, the government ran around the clock trying to confirm where each citizen was being held. Lists were created, maps were marked, information came in slowly, often through travelers who had managed to escape or through diplomatic messages passed in secret. Families waited by their phones every day, hoping for a call or any small detail that proved their loved one was still alive. By October 1990, Saddam started letting small groups of hostages go. Some were allowed to leave because they had serious health issues. Others were freed after specific diplomatic meetings, usually involving countries Saddam felt he could gain something from. A handful of British hostages were included in these early releases, but the majority stayed behind. Many were still scattered across dangerous industrial areas. Children remained in guarded buildings, often without knowing when they would see their friends or teachers again. Fathers continued to live under armed watch near power stations and oil facilities. Mothers worried constantly about the possibility of being separated a second time if the situation changed again. Still, these small releases lit a spark of hope for families across the world. But hope didn't erase the bigger truth. The United Nations had given Iraq a clear ultimatum to leave Kuwait by the 15th of January 1991 or face military action. This date became the center of every conversation in embassies, newsrooms, and military bases. And inside Iraq, the hostages knew the meaning of this deadline too. It wasn't something they read in newspapers. Guards whispered about it. Workers overheard Iraqi officers talking, and everyone could sense that tension was rising. Some hostages reported hearing the roar of jets flying overhead, even though they couldn't see them. Others noticed more military trucks and soldiers moving around at night. These signs made it clear that Iraq was preparing for a fight, and the hostages were sitting right in the middle of a country bracing for war. Then, in the final weeks before the UN deadline, Saddam suddenly took a dramatic turn. He began releasing large groups of Western hostages at once. By December 1990, nearly all British families had been freed. It happened far quicker than anyone expected. Some hostages were taken straight to Baghdad International Airport for special flights arranged by their governments. Others were driven to Jordan in long convoys and handed over to diplomats waiting at the border. These mass releases had nothing to do with kindness. Saddam understood that a war was now certain, and he didn't want to be blamed for civilian deaths when airstrikes started. He also knew the hostages no longer served a purpose. Their presence wasn't stopping the coalition, and keeping them would only make Iraq look worse when fighting began. Even though the hostages were safe now, the region was far from calm. Kuwait was still occupied, and the countdown to war kept moving forward. On January 17, 1991, the conflict reached its breaking point. The coalition launched Operation Desert Storm, a massive air campaign that targeted Iraqi military positions across both Iraq and Kuwait. In the first hours, waves of aircraft struck radar stations, missile sites, airfields, and communication centers. The intensity was unlike anything Iraq had faced before. The war moved with incredible speed because the coalition had overwhelming strength and advanced technology. Explosions lit up the night sky over major cities, and the ground shook in many areas. Former hostages watched from their homes in Britain and other countries, relieved they had escaped before the strikes began. When these hostages finally settled back into their normal lives, they carried emotional scars that followed them for years. Some struggled with sudden fear whenever they heard loud noises. Others found it difficult to sleep, worried that something might go wrong even though they were safe now. A few avoided talking about their time in Iraq altogether because the memories were too heavy. Children who had appeared on television next to Saddam grew up with memories that never faded. Parents carried guilt for not being able to shield their children from fear. The UK government later reviewed how it handled overseas emergencies. Changes were made to evacuation plans and early warning systems, so citizens abroad would not be caught in a similar crisis again. But no policy could take away what those families had lived through, all because they happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time.